there, jewelry maker. Today we're going to make this super quick and easy wire heart pendant, which features a simple coiled coil. The coil serves a couple of purposes. First, it secures the focal bead in place, and secondly, it adds a wonderful pop of texture to an otherwise clean and modern design. Coiling is a fun technique to learn, and it's one you'll need to add to your skill set if you want to explore heady style wire work. My name is Wendy, and I'm the wire weaver behind Door 44. If you want to learn to make wire jewelry, this channel's for you. You'll need very few supplies for today's project, and as always, you'll find a complete list of tools and materials in the video description below. Okay, before we get started, let's talk a little bit about the wire gauge that you'll need to use. It's really going to depend on the size of bead that you use and the type of bead. So this is an 8mm check glass roundel, and the hole size on this is big enough to take 18 gauge wire. So that's what this is made with. And then these crystal roundels have slightly larger holes, so I was able to use 16 gauge wire on both of these pendants. This is an 8mm crystal roundel, and this is a 10mm crystal roundel. And again, these are both made with 16 gauge wire, which is what I'm going to be using to demonstrate today. And then this pendant has an 8mm large hole freshwater pearl, and this is made with 14 gauge wire. Now I used all of the same measurements on these pendants, so the same length of wire, but here's 18 gauge, 16 gauge, and 14 gauge. And you can see that they all have nice proportions. The 14 gauge just looks a little bit chunkier. And then today I'm going to be using this 10mm round bead, and again, this is 16 gauge wire. So take a look at the bead that you want to use. Anything between 8 and 12mm rondelle to round will work. And again, determine your wire gauge that you're going to use for your main pendant frame based on what will fit comfortably in the hole of your bead. So anything between 18 and 14 gauge wire will work, and like I say, all the measurements are the same. You're just going to end up with slightly different proportions whether you use 18 gauge, 16 gauge, or 14 gauge wire. Once you've determined what wire gauge you want to use, you're going to need about 6.5 inches of that wire. So in this case, I'm using 16 gauge wire. I'm going to go ahead and cut 6.5 inches of that. And for those of you that use the metric system, that'll be about 16.5 centimeters. We're going to go ahead and mark our wire at 3 inches. 3 inches or 7.5 centimeters. And then the next thing we're going to do is create the fold in our wire. This is going to form the top portion of our heart. So we just want to grasp that wire just to the side of your mark that you made, and we're going to press this into a tight fold. And you can see there, I'm not going to tighten this all the way, but I am going to squeeze it just a bit. We want to get that fold almost completely closed, but we want to leave enough gap that our chain can slide around. So you can orient this chain multiple different ways. You can position your chain over on one side or the other, or you can have your chain with one side on each side of the hoop so that the heart hangs squarely. I kind of like it hanging off at this angle, so when I wear this necklace, I tend to keep my chain over here on this side. But it's personal preference. You have lots of different options, but this is why we want to leave that fold open just a bit so that we have enough room to move our chain around, and whoever's wearing the necklace can position the chain wherever they like. Okay, once you have your fold in place, you want to grab the fold with your flat nose pliers and make sure that your shorter end is on top, and then we're just going to bend this open just a little bit, and I'm going to put my finger right there above the pliers so that I don't form a kink right there where the jaws meet the wire. We just want to open that up a little bit so that we can get our ring mandrel into place. And a ring mandrel is what we're going to use next to shape our heart. And we're going to use size 5 on our ring mandrel for the shorter side of the heart. And I'm just going to place that fold right on size 5 on my ring mandrel. And I'm going to press that wire around the ring mandrel all the way around until I have a shape that looks like that. Grab the very tip of your wire with your flat nose pliers and just bend that out a little bit, create a little bit of a curve just like that. Okay, at this point, we're going to go ahead and hammer. We want to hammer this curve before we shape the other side of the heart, because we're going to hammer this tail down here a little bit as well. Okay, so as always, I'm just going to hammer this curve, and I'm just doing this to lock in that shape. but I also want to draw that wire out a little bit. Just thicken it up a little bit so we have a little bit of dimension there. Can you see how that line looks a little bit thicker? It sort of looks like a hand-drawn line when we do that. And that's what the point of this design is. I kind of want it to look like line art. And then we're going to paddle this end at the bottom. So again, just light drawing strokes and just draw that paddle out. And then next, of course, we're going to use our needle file to go ahead and shape that paddle. And I want to shape this, I want to round it a little bit, but I want my curve to be sort of slanted toward the tip here. So not a perfectly round shape. We're going to make it a little bit of an oval shape. So that it ends up looking just like that. See that? Okay, next step, we're going to go back to our ring mandrel. And this time I'm going to position my curve right on my fold, right on the size 10. And I'm going to press that wire around all the way until it crosses over our tail from the first bend. And this is what that looks like now. Okay, now we have to be, at this point, we have to be a little bit strategic about how we proceed. I'm going to go ahead and hammer this portion of the curve a little bit, and then I'm going to put my bead on. Now, when we hammered the other piece, we hammered with this face here against the bench block. So this is going to be the front of our pendant, and we want to make sure that this is also the front side. We don't want tool marks on this side. So we're actually going to hammer this on the back side. So you're going to place your curve on your bench block, and you want to keep it so the wire is flat on the bench block. You don't want to place it like this, because if you hammer there, you're going to close up that gap and you're going to just create some potential kinks in your wire. So make sure your curve sits flat on your bench block, and then let's hammer that out. And again, we're going to draw this out a little bit. We want to thicken that line. And I want to come down just a little bit on this straight part of the curve. Because what that's going to do, that's going to give us a little bit of a square spot where we can really anchor our coiled coil. Okay, next step. Before you proceed, make sure you put your bead on, because once you hammer this end, it's going to thicken your wire out and it will be too thick for you to get your bead onto your heart. And now we're just going to open this up a little bit. We're going to twist it just like a jump ring. And again, I'm going from the back side. So I want this surface here to be the front of my wire. I want it to be nice and flat and free of tool marks. So I'm placing this front side down on the bench block. And I'm going to just twist this up a little bit more to get it out of the way. And I just want to draw this wire out. I don't want to paddle it, but I want to lengthen it and flatten it. So we're just going to hammer it's about 1/2 inch there that we hammered, and we just want to flatten that wire a little bit. And what that does is it gives us this nice sort of interesting texture here where we have the wire flattened, and we're going to secure it around that tail. See that? Okay, so that's all your hammering. And now at this point, we can go ahead and secure that tail. So I'm just going to grab on with my nylon jaw pliers. This is the easiest way to do it. If you hold with your nylon jaw pliers and grip just a little bit above that curve, or above that point where the wires cross, hold on tight and then gently wrap that tail around. Now this might take some strength depending on the gauge of wire you're using. This is 16 gauge wire. It's a little bit easier with 18 gauge and a little bit more difficult with 14 gauge. And then just use your flat nose pliers if you need to adjust that wire. And I'm going to use my flat nose to go ahead and finish these wraps, because this is quite tight. Your wire's pretty hard at this point because we've hammered it. So it's not going to be as easy to wrap around as it was when it was dead soft. So I'm just going to keep working my way around there and until I get 3 wraps. And that looks pretty good right there. And then I will go ahead and trim off that tail in the back. And And then I'm going to press that down with my flat nose pliers. I want to tuck that in, make sure it's nice and tight and that there's no sharp bits sticking up. Now there's a little bit of a high spot there that's a little bit pointy, so we're going to go ahead and file that off using our needle file. And this is the back of the pendant, so you don't have to worry too much about scratching things. Try not to scratch it too much, but the main point is we want some soft edges there. We don't want anything that's sharp that could cause a scratch. Okay, that feels pretty good. And now at this point, our bead is hanging loose. That's okay. We're going to go ahead and do some sanding and finishing on this piece, and then the last thing we'll do is add our coiled coil. Okay, so let's take a look at our piece here. This is the front of our pendant, the front side, and you can see I got some fairly deep scratches there on that tail. So I'm going to use my 400 grit sanding stick to go ahead and buff those scratches out. And I also want to just sort of round off the edges of this point a little bit, just so it looks a little bit softer and more sculpted. Now if you don't have sanding sticks, you can also use 400 grit sandpaper. It'll work just as well for this. And I will link to these sanding sticks in the description. I've only found them at Rio Grande. I'm not a Rio Grande affiliate. This is in no way sponsored, but I do like these sanding. They're actually called sanding boards. I like them a lot. They work really well for this sort of thing. So that took care of those deep scratches there. And everything else is looking pretty good. I don't have too many tool marks. I did make some tool marks there, so I'm going to sand those wraps just a little bit where I got some tool marks on them. Just soften those up, kind of clean up the tool marks. And on the back side here, I'm going to also clean up that point where I cut the wire. And I'll go ahead and sand this off a little bit as well, this tail in the back. The back side isn't really going to be seen, but you still want it to look nice. So take out any deep scratches or tool marks that you have there, and that looks a lot better. It feels a lot better. There's no sharp edges there now that are going to cause any scratches or snag on clothing. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and use my sandpaper. As always, I use 3 different grits of sandpaper. I have 800 grit, which is what I start with, and then I move up to 1500 and 2000. So we'll take our 800 grit sandpaper. We're just going to clean up all the bits that we sanded with our 400 grit sanding board. I just want everything to have a nice consistent finish. So I'm going to keep sanding until that tail looks nice, has a nice consistent finish. See that? And same thing here where we sanded on those wraps. I'll just clean those up a little bit. I'll clean up the back. And we'll sand that tail again a little bit. And I'm not going to spend too much time on the back because, again, this isn't going to be seen. But you want to make sure that you get sort of an even finish. Whenever you're sanding, with whatever grit you're using, you should have a very even brushed look. And the heavier the grit, the more defined that brushed metal look is going to be. So we're going to do the same thing here on the portions that we hammered. Just sand those off a little bit. And we're going to sort of sand the edges. We want those edges to be nice and rounded so that it looks sculpted. And that's looking pretty good. See how those edges now have more of a round profile than the flat sort of beveled profile that you see here? Can you see that difference? That's what you want. You want your edges to be just nice and round and smooth. And then same thing on this part of the heart. Now if you're having trouble taking down the edges, you can use your 400 grit sandpaper or your 400 grit sanding board, and that'll remove that material a little quicker and get those edges looking nice and soft and round. And then again, wherever you touch, with 400 grit, you need to go back over it with 800 grit to clean it up. Otherwise you're going to have a uneven finish on your curves here. And just sort of protect your bead, make sure that it doesn't get scratched up by your sandpaper. And that's looking pretty good. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue with 1500 grit and then 2000, and then we'll be back to see how this looks. So our pendant is all sanded and cleaned up now. We don't have any heavy scratches. We have nice soft edges on our cut ends, and at this point we just want to go ahead and dust it off and clean it up a little bit. This is just an old sunshine cloth These sunshine cloths will last you a long time. Once they stop polishing jewelry, they still work well for cleaning things, cleaning your bench, cleaning your tools, and just cleaning off pieces that you're working on throughout the process. So don't toss these. Go ahead and keep them and use them as long as you possibly can. Get your money's worth out of them. So at this point, we are ready to start our coiled coil. And for that, you're going to need 2 different gauges of wire. You'll need some 28 gauge dead soft, and I just have some wire here on a bobbin that I'm going to use. It's going to take about 18 inches to 2 feet of 28 gauge wire, depending on the size of your bead, because this is a slightly larger bead and it's a round bead. This is probably going to be closer to the 24 inches of 28 gauge wire side of the spectrum. And for these other pendants that I made with smaller beads, I used about 18 inches of 28 gauge wire for these. So just make sure you cut enough wire that you'll have plenty. You don't want to have too much scrap, but you want to have enough that you can get through this without having to splice your wire, because it is really difficult to splice wire on a coil. And then the other gauge we're going to use is 22 gauge. I'm using half hard 22 gauge wire. You can use dead soft, whatever you have on hand. Don't worry about whether or not it's half hard or dead soft. It really doesn't matter for this particular application. So I'm going to cut 5 inches of 22 gauge wire. And that works out to about 13 centimeters. So 5 inches or 13 centimeters of wire. And then to begin my coil, I'm going to start here on the side that I hammered. This flatter portion of the wire is really going to help grip that coil and hold it on there tightly. So you just want to wrap this wire around your heart above the bead 3 times. Get it as tight as you can, and you can use your flat nose pliers to kind of line up your coils, tighten them up a little bit around the wire. Be careful not to cause any tool marks. You don't want to add tool marks there. And then you just want to trim that tail off on the back side and tuck that end down with your flat nose pliers. Okay, so there's our coil, and it's going to sit right at the part of the heart there where it starts to come down into the straight portion. And we just want to get it on there so it's nice and tight. And then go ahead and grab your 28 gauge wire, and we're going to start coiling this around this coil. So I'm just going to hang on to this tail here, and to start with, I'm just going to go ahead and do this, put 3 or 4 coils on there. And then once you get enough of a coil started, you can pinch that tightly between your thumb and your index finger and start rotating your pendant. And that's going to start coiling that wire. So coil a little bit and then compress your coil, because until you get enough where you can really get your fingers around there, it's going to be hard to keep it nice and neat. But just go ahead and keep twisting and squeeze tightly. That helps that wire coil nice and neatly around your 22 gauge wire. And again, compress. So just keep coiling a little bit. And we're going to coil until we can estimate that we have enough wire to complete the 3 wraps and then the wrap around the bead. So we're going to do 3 wraps around the wire frame, and then we're going to go around the bead and do another 3 wraps. So see how that coil gets kind of loose there? Again, you want to keep a very tight grip between your thumb and your index finger. Keep it nice and tight and just keep twisting. Now there are lots of different ways to do coils. One technique that most people use who make heavy jewelry, they'll use a power drill, and that's something that takes a little bit of practice, but it's an easy technique to do. And if you'd like to see a tutorial for that, I'm going to link to a tutorial right up here in the right hand corner. It's not one of my tutorials, it's a tutorial from Raftark Jewelry, and the guy from Raftark makes some really beautiful jewelry. He does a lot of heady style jewelry, and he has some wonderful tutorials, so I'll go ahead and share that tutorial up there if you want to learn to make coils with a drill. Okay, so I have about, let's see here, I've coiled about 1 inch so far, and that's going to be enough to make my 3 wraps, and it's going to start going around my bead. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and cut off a tail of wire, and I'm going to leave myself about 18 inches at this point. Because I haven't made this pendant with a bead this size yet, this large 10 millimeter round, I'm not exactly sure how much coiling wire this is going to take, so I'm just going to make sure I give myself plenty of wire so that I don't run out. Okay, now where you have your tail, you can go ahead and coil that tail on there and just use up every bit of your wire that you can and get as much out of this wire as possible. And you want to be careful that you don't cross over onto your coils like I did just there. So I'm going to back that off a little bit, and then I'm going to coil around, compress my coil. Coils are a little fiddly to make. It's one of the things, it's a technique that I don't really love. I don't use a lot of these in my work, so I'm not that great at making them, quite honestly, as you can see me fumbling around here. But I just want to go ahead and use as much of my wire as I possibly can, so I don't have a lot of scrap. So I'm just going to go ahead and coil this all the way, and once I get to the end there, I can use my flat nose pliers again to just tuck that end neatly around. Okay, so we're going to slide that coil back, slide it back into position so it's right there at the beginning of that fourth wrap. So we're about to start our fourth wrap around, and now we're just going to go ahead and do that wrap. We're going to roll this wire around, pull your tail through, and you want to make 3 wraps with your coiled 22 gauge wire. And then once we get those 3 wraps, I'm going to straighten out our wire again, and we're going to continue coiling. So now we want to coil enough wire to go around the bead and complete the next 3 wraps. And you can see there I've got about another inch of wire. So now I'm going to bring this coil around the bead and behind, and then up and over. And bring your wire tail through, straighten out your 22 gauge wire. And so there's our first wrap around. Just continue coiling, and now we'll just go ahead and finish wrapping those coils. So there's 2 and 3. And you can see there that I coiled just a little bit more than I needed. So I'm going to go ahead and unwind a little bit of this wire here to about right there. Make sure my coil's pressed nice and tight. And then I'm going to continue wrapping just the plain 22 gauge wire tail around 3 times. And that's it. There is your coiled coil. Now at this point you can just go ahead and break your 28 gauge wire. So you're just going to tug, swirl, and break. And that broke on the back, and it broke nice and cleanly, so I don't have any points sticking up out of there. And then I'm going to just trim off my 22 gauge wire tail. Trim that off. And I will snug that down with my flat nose pliers. Again, you want to make sure everything's nice and tight and neat, and you can snug up your coils if you like. Play with them until you're satisfied with the look. And there you go. So our pendant is very nearly complete. The last thing we want to do is just go ahead and hand sculpt it a little bit. I'm going to bend this curve. I'm going to add just a little bit of a curve there. I'm going to add the same curve on this side. We just want to give this a really hand sculpted look so that as it lays against the skin, it has some dimension. And that's it. That's all there is to it. At this point, all you need to do is add some chain and a clasp. And you can see here I added a 16-inch chain and a handmade clasp. This is my Easy Infinity clasp. I will go ahead and link to that tutorial in the description if you'd like to grab that tutorial. It's just $5. And I show you how to make this clasp in 3 different sizes with 3 different gauges of wire, so it'll suit virtually any necklace you can imagine. This is the small size with delicate chain, so very tiny delicate links. And then I just connected it with wrap loop connectors, and I will also link up here in the right hand corner to a tutorial for those connectors in case you're wondering how to make them. They're quick and easy to make and so very handy for attaching chain, making rosary chain, anything like that. So You'll definitely want to know how to make those links. So go ahead and watch that tutorial if you like. And that's it for today, Jewelry Maker. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Until next time, go make something beautiful.